Housekeeping things before we get started. If you don't mind staying muted during the call, because I think we are going to have quite a few people on this call. So keep your microphone and your video muted so we'll be able to keep the speakers in a relatively larger format for folks tuning in. The second main point is if you have a question when we get to the Q&A period, if you could submit those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom part of your screen for most people on Zoom, that'll allow you to type your questions in there, and we'll be able to get those questions, receive those questions, and add those to our list when we get to that part of the conversation. All right, let me begin. My name is William Norris. I'm a professor here at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. I run the Economic Statecraft program here, and I'm honored to be joined for today's event by a couple other terrific programs we have here at the Bush School as co-sponsors for this event, and our external partner, the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation, which is doing some really great work, both in the sense of the legacy of Andrew Marshall and what he was able to do from a strategic thinking perspective for the United States, but also more broadly with the contemporary new generation of upcoming analysts and strategists. So I'm honored today to welcome them. I'm looking forward to our conversation. I think it's going to be some great content for folks. We're going to run for about 1 hour altogether. So 1 o'clock Central Time is when we'll wrap. And I'm going to hand it off first to Jamie Durham, who's going to be able to talk a little bit about some of the context for the conversation we're about to have here. So Jamie, over to you. Jamie, you're still muted on your mic, so you got to unmute your mic.
Thanks. Sorry. So, Will, Killeen, thank you very much for hosting us. And you know, the Bush School is near and dear to my heart, and probably Jeff's heart and Bob's heart. We all worked directly or indirectly for President George H.W. Bush, as well as President George W. Bush. And so this is a terrific opportunity for Jeff and Bob to talk about the book by Andy Marshall and the reflections, and they'll talk a little bit more about how it all got put together. But for those of you who don't know who Andy Marshall is or was, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, he was at the forefront of U.S. national security strategy for probably over 6 decades. And he found and mentored a lot of people. He was very interdisciplinary in his thinking. And he was just, he left us way too early, because I think, as Jeff and Bob and anybody else who's met him will tell you, that he left us all with questions. And for Andy, it was always about the question and not about the answer. It was very diagnostic in nature. And, you know, but he always looked for, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, he always said that good answers to mediocre questions were better than good answers to bad questions. And he put together quite a legacy, and you can look him up. I don't want to really take the time away from Jeff and Bob in the book, but Reflections is Andy in his own voice. And it's because of the way it was structured, because of the way it is structured, which is just a transcription of a series of interviews done in the 90s. It gets a little dense and a little complicated sometimes, and I encourage people to read and reread the book. And but I think that even if we hadn't just transcribed the conversations and edited it more, it'd still be pretty dense, just understanding how Andy thought. So with that, you know, after Andy passed, well, before he passed away, Andy and I created the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation, which was really to go out and find the new voices, the people that are fearless about jumping into this pool of complicated and complex problems, and understanding what the problems are before starting to look for an answer. answers that are unknowable because you're looking at the future 25 to 30 years from now. And, but you also understand that you have to go back 25 or 30 years into the past and understand history, because you just can't footnote history and draw a straight line to the future. It doesn't work. And so all of you who are on the call today, we encourage you to take a look at the website. We run a series of projects every year. We call them experiments because we really look for people that are interested in kind of just having fun and thinking about opportunity and thinking about the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff McKitrick, who's a great friend of mine, and Bob Angevine, who's equally a great friend of mine. Jeffrey and I worked together for Andy back a long time ago. You know, so this book is very much a you know, a work of love, and hopefully we will have a book coming out in the near future that based on a series of lectures we did or interviews we did with Andy in the mid 2000s. So with that, I'm going to be quiet, and Jeff, Bob, it's up to you guys.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Will, for having us here to talk about this the book that Bob and I worked on for a long time, but it sat dormant for many years. These interviews were done in the 90s, and I had a transcript, and I had let somebody look at them, and they said, you know, you should turn this into a book. So I talked to the people here at IDA, and I talked to Jamie, and together they sponsored Bob and I to take those transcripts and turn them into the book that's called Reflections on Net Assessment by Andrew Marshall. As Jamie mentioned, it's a fairly dense book. Those transcripts were lightly edited because it was our intent for people to really hear Andy speak in his own voice. And so we didn't want to do too much to what he actually said. So in some places it may seem a little cryptic, but that was often Andy's nature. But you can bet you would never have heard him say as much as he said in these interviews if you were ever talking to him. So I think if you read those, you'll get a good sense for the man and where he was coming from. And in many ways, Andy was net assessment. He really initiated that discipline within the Office of the Secretary of Defense and pursued it for decades and developed it and made it better over time for the practitioners of that technique. Having said that, I was asked to talk about some of the themes in the book. And I think what I would like to do is just start with one big organizing principle. And that is that Andy viewed the relationship with the Soviet Union in terms of a long-term military competition. And that really became sort of the organizing principle for a lot of the things that were done in the Office of Net Assessment over the years. So if you start with that as an organizing principle, clearly one of the first orders of business is try to understand the competitor. And this is something that's often not looked at very seriously or deeply in the Defense Department or by the services, because there's so much focus on ourselves. But Andy's view was that to really get a good sense of where the strategic competition was going, you really needed a deep understanding of the competitor. And that means the competitor's objectives, the strategic objectives, the military objectives, the competitor's history, their strategic culture, and a number of the dimensions of the nation that's the competitor that go across the entire national spectrum. And that takes a long time, and it takes a lot of serious work to really understand where the competitor is coming from, what they're trying to achieve, and then what it means for us. Secondly, the competition was a very complex competition. I would say not as complex as the one we have with China today, but still fairly complex. It was primarily military with the Soviet Union, but it had a lot of different dimensions. And so Andy's approach was to take the competition and break it into different competitive spaces or areas, if you will. And those were the functional and regional net assessments that were developed over the years by the office. So there was one on the NATO-Warsaw Pact military balance for for those of you old enough to remember the Warsaw Pact, or even NATO as it once was. There was the maritime balance. There was the strategic nuclear balance, the undersea balance. There were a number of different military areas of military competition that Andy divided the competition, the overall competition in these areas to make them more tractable. And even then, his judgment was that it would take generally about 10 years to develop and produce a net assessment, to do the research that was necessary, develop the tools that were necessary to do that. Every net assessment was different. There was no template, there was no format, there was no, he didn't even give you an approach. When I went in there to do the NATO-Warsaw Pact military balance, he told me just take 6 months and read all the classified documents we were in a skiff, and then draw up an outline of what I thought it should look like. So I did that, and I failed miserably. My outline was 10 pages long and included everything I could think of about NATO and the Warsaw Pact. It was totally ridiculous. And he told me to take another crack at it. And I found out years later, after I finally successfully completed the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance, that he actually had a framework in mind. But he didn't share it with me because he saw this as sort of equivalent to getting a PhD. And this was my dissertation. And so I had to own it. It had to be mine, not his. I sort of stumbled onto the truth eventually, and I produced an assessment that he thought was pretty good. But again, no two of them were the same. Because of the multifaceted nature of the competition, that meant that you really needed a multidisciplinary approach to examine it. So it had a military focus, but you had to look at other dimensions of the competitor and the competition. So it was useful to look at demographics and the demographic trends. It was useful to look at the science and technology base, at their financial and economic situation, and a wide range of things like that. So it really became a very broad scope, which meant that you needed a broad range of sources. You couldn't just rely on the intelligence community because they were more focused on the military competition. And even when the ones that were looking at the economic competition, or let's say the political ideological competition, they were coming from their own backgrounds. And Andy always felt it was better to in addition to that, to supplement that with people that actually have lived in those countries, have worked in those countries, whether they were American businessmen abroad, maybe they were with a church, they were ministers abroad, they were educators, teachers abroad, they were emigres from those countries. And so he really reached out to a broad range of people to try to get an understanding of the Soviet Union, where they were going and why they were going there. One of the techniques that he liked to use, and Jamie alluded to this, is to look at history and to use historical case studies to try to illuminate or inform the assessment and improve our understanding of the competitor. And by doing that, you could develop some long-term trends and asymmetries. He generally said, try to look back 10 to 15 years and look forward 5 to 10 years if you could. The long-term trends and asymmetries that were developed by doing historical case studies would form the basis for a projection 5 to 10 years out. There's a projection, it's not a prediction. We're not in the prediction business. We don't have a little crystal ball to say what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years. But if you take a look at the long-term trends, it's very difficult for nations to fundamentally change their character and their nature. And so some of those long-term trends are going to give you a good idea of where they're headed in the future. And so that became a key element in the assessment that was trying to identify those long-term trends and asymmetries. And the asymmetries themselves became the basis for understanding what the specific challenges were that we faced in that competitive area, and where the opportunities were that we could exploit to improve our competitive standing vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And so again, that became a key element of the net assessment. As Jamie mentioned, Andy's approach was to be diagnostic, not prescriptive. He was trying to understand what was the nature of the competition and where was it likely to go. And that way he could inform senior decision makers and they could use that to help shape their decisions, resource allocation, personnel policies, weapons acquisition, et cetera. And so he wasn't looking for what's the right weapon to buy, what's the silver bullet out there. He was just working on trying to understand the nature of the competition, which is why, as Jamie mentioned, he focused on trying to get the questions right. He felt if you got the questions right, you could get a lot of people working on the answers. But if you start with the wrong question, it didn't matter how many people you had working on the answers, you're not going to get to where you need to go. So I think I'll stop at this point and let Bob talk about some things that he's got lined up, and then I look forward to your questions later on.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks to Will Norris and Texas A&M for hosting us, and to Jamie and Stephanie and the foundation for helping us get this book published. So I thought what I would do is use a specific kind of anecdote to highlight some of the principles or concepts that Andy Marshall employed very effectively throughout his career. And in particular, what I wanted to talk about was Western attempts to understand Soviet intentions towards Norway during the Cold War. So for most of the Cold War, the conventional wisdom in the West was that Norway and the entire northern flank was essentially a sideshow. It was an adjunct theater to the primary fight, which would take place along the Central Front, the very area that Jeff analyzed during his net assessment. And so that the conventional wisdom was that, Norway was not all that important. Anything that happened there would really be only a supporting action with regard to the Central Front, and therefore Soviet operations were likely to be fairly small, not particularly significant. But Andy, among others, came up with a very different view of Soviet intentions towards Norway later in the Cold War. And so I want to talk about that. But that view really originated in the early 1960s. So in 1964, Andy Marshall was in Paris working for NATO, but primarily just kind of enjoying life and cuisine in the City of Lights, when he was asked by the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, Harry Rowan, to accompany a U.S. military delegation to Norway. And the Norwegians had asked the U.S. military to come and kind of tour their northern frontier because they were concerned that NATO, and in particular AF North, which is the northern kind of command of NATO, was not paying sufficient attention to Soviet intentions, in part because it was led by a British general, and the Norwegians remembered what the British had done at Narvik in World War II and were not convinced that the British had the Norwegians' best interests in mind. So the Norwegians took Andy and a couple of other U.S. military officers on an extensive tour of their northern bases and airfields. And so this happened in 1964. And the basic Norwegian message was that the Soviets attached far greater importance to Norway than was typically understood by NATO and the West. And that in the event of a conflict, the Soviets would very likely try to seize the northern portion of Norway in order to protect some of their key installations on the Kola Peninsula. So Andy absorbed the Norwegian message, came back, wrote a report but really was not particularly involved in anything having to do with Norway for another decade or so. But it stayed in his mind such that when I interviewed him about this 50 years later, he could tell me the names of every base that he went to. So his memory was remarkable. But so anyways, so kind of things regarding Norway stayed fairly quiet until the early 1970s, when the Soviets started to institute a change in their naval and nuclear strategy. And in particular, what they did is they had a new ballistic missile submarine, the Delta class, equipped with a new missile, the SSN-8, coming online. And that missile could range the United States from waters just off the Soviet coast in the Barents Sea. And so the Soviets began to adopt what was later dubbed a bastion strategy. They would keep their ballistic missile submarines fairly close to their own bases and would protect those ballistic missile submarines with air, surface, and subsurface assets. So this kind of started happening around 1973. There were a number of open source analysts who were reading Soviet statements in the open press and in their military journals, who began to pick up on this move to the bastion strategy in the mid-1970s. One of them was a retired Admiral Robert Wielander, probably most famous for being implicated in an effort by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to spy on Richard Nixon in the early 1970s. But Wielander and others noted that the Soviets were very concerned about the survivability of their ballistic missile submarines, and were very likely to prioritize protection of those submarines over all other naval missions. And the conclusions of these open source analysts were generally poo-pooed by most other observers, including the bulk of the US Navy. But Andy paid attention. In part, he had been working on kind of maritime balance, and he recognized that if the Soviets were really planning to keep all of their surface and subsurface assets close to shore to protect their ballistic missile submarines, that was a huge strategic advantage for the United States, and something that the United States should do everything in its power to encourage. So by 1978, Andy had essentially concluded that the United States was looking at Norway in kind of the wrong way. We had typically been thinking of it as a land theater. It was the northern flank to the key fight in the central flank. And he began to argue, no, it's really a maritime theater. And a theater that the Soviets would value very highly, much more highly than we had previously thought, in order to protect those ballistic missile submarine bastions. It took the Office of Naval Intelligence until 1981 to kind of finally accept this change in Soviet thinking. It then took another year to convince the intelligence community and Navy leadership. And it really wasn't until the mid-1980s, 1984 is when the maritime strategy was first published, which was an effort by the US Navy to do what exactly Andy had recommended some 6 years earlier, which is do everything in our power to keep Soviet forces in a protection mode around those bastions by putting as much pressure as we could on those ballistic missile submarine bastions. So what does this episode tell us about kind of Andy's way of thinking? The first thing is something that Jeff has already mentioned, the importance of understanding the competitor. So, and one key component of that is avoiding mirror imaging. So one of the reasons why the Navy took so long to kind of accept this notion that Soviet thinking had changed is because when it was explained to him that, or when it was explained to Navy admirals that the Soviets intended to keep all of their most effective forces close to shore in order to protect their ballistic missile submarines, the U.S. admiral said, well, no right-thinking admiral would ever operate their Navy in that way. Not understanding that, the way the U.S. Navy operates is not necessarily the way that the Soviet Navy would operate or any other Navy around the world would operate. Another example is the Soviets developed what they called anti-submarine warfare cruisers, which were, in fact, you can see one in operation today. It's now become the Chinese aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. But it essentially, it's a short, a relatively small aircraft carrier. We think of it as an aircraft carrier with vertical takeoff. The Soviet plan was to use those to protect their bastions. But when the US Navy saw the Soviets building them, they saw aircraft carriers being built and immediately concluded that the Soviets were set on conducting a blue water global naval strategy. Another key part of understanding your competitor is focusing on not just strengths, but also weaknesses, right? So one of the U.S. tended, and the U.S. Navy feared Soviet interdiction of the sea lines of communication to Europe because that was seen as a potential strength of the Soviet Union and a weakness of the United States. But one of the things Andy recognized is that it's also important to understand, what does your opponent fear? What is your opponent really concerned about? And as Wielander had pointed out, the Soviets were very concerned about the survivability of their ballistic missile submarines. So understanding not just what your opponent is good at, but also what they are not so good at and what they might fear is an important part of understanding your opponent. Second key point, and this is something that Jeff had also mentioned, is listening to the concerns of those kind of closest to the issue. In this case, it's allies. So typically, I would argue that the US tends to downplay warnings of allies, especially kind of smaller allies, because we typically see that as, oh, they just want more free stuff, right? They want more protection. But in many cases, those allies are closest to the problem and have a unique understanding of some of the issues. So the Norwegians had listening posts set up all along the Norwegian-Soviet border. Many of the summer camps in the Norwegian north were actually kind of clandestine listening posts for the Norwegian intelligence service to kind of monitor what the Soviets were doing. So the US tended not to weight appropriately the the Norwegian view of what the Soviets might be doing. Third key principle is mining the open source literature. So the key insights regarding the Soviet adoption of the Bastion strategy really came from open source analysis. And this is another case where the Navy reacted by saying, well, why would they tell us what they intend to do? That the leading admirals of the Navy had a real skepticism towards open source analysis. But Andy had, by the time that this episode occurred, had already started a much broader effort to analyze kind of open source Soviet military writings and had a real appreciation for how accurate and revelatory those kinds of writings could be. Fourth key point is understanding non-rational aspects of behavior. So we tend to think of our competitors as purely rational, making very calculated decisions. And Andy was always of the notion that no, those decisions are often the product of organizations who are often acting to protect their own organizational interests. And they're also the product of historical experiences. So one of the historical experiences that affected decision-making in this case was, in fact, the U.S. Navy's historical experience in the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. So the U.S. Navy had suffered great losses during the Battle of the Atlantic and was laser focused on preventing a recurrence of that in the Cold War, even to the exclusion of potential opportunities like the Soviet adoption of the Bastion strategy. And then the last kind of point I would highlight is just the notion of considering alternative views. One of the things Andy would often point out is that there are real experts, people who have particular knowledge or a unique point of view. Often those experts are not necessarily valued by the kind of conventional reward systems of academia or the intelligence community. So he would go out of his way to find people who had a different perspective that was nevertheless potentially valuable and listen to them. And one of the cases, it's not related to Norway, but there was an economist named Warren Nutter, who very early on was very skeptical of the Soviet economy and how productive it was. And at the time, Nutter's views were not widely embraced. And in fact, he was not accepted at many of the Ivy League institutions, and it was kind of generally shunted into a corner in the economics profession. But Andy always pointed to Nutter's experience as an example of, hey, here's somebody who in the end proved to be far more accurate than the conventional wisdom. And so it's worthwhile to kind of seek out some of those alternative views and give them a listen. And I think with that, I will end and look forward to questions.
Great. So we'll go ahead and jump into some of the questions. I think we've got about 25 minutes or so. The first one is kind of on that last point about the importance of diversity and having those alternative perspectives in this kind of a dynamic where you're really thinking strategically in the way that Andy Marshall is known to have done. How did he seek those things out? I think you talked a little bit about already, but how did he sort of sort the signal from the noise when he found those alternative perspectives? How did he know, let's say, I don't know what the ratio is, but let's say 1 out of 10 is going to be worthwhile, but the other 9 are sort of cuckoo. Any thoughts about how or did he sort of keep all 10 and just kind of keep them on the shelf for a rainy day? And as events changed, he would go back and use his incredible memory to kind of reach back and tap into those ideas that are a little bit off the wall. But a little bit about how to sort the signal from the noise when you do seek out that broad range of alternative perspectives.
So I think that you have to remember that he was born in 1921. So in 1973, he's already, 52 years old. He's already had a full career at RAND. He was exposed to at RAND special intelligence compartments that gave him insights that other people didn't have. And so his experience allowed him to be sort of a human intellectual triage machine. But I will say that he would listen to people, and he wouldn't immediately jump to a conclusion. He would keep an open mind and just continue to collect information. One of my favorite stories, Steve Rosen tells it. It's about himself, but when he first went to work for Andy early on in the early years of the office, Andy tasked him with writing an Asia Pacific assessment. And Steve, being a good academic, Harvard trained, et cetera. So he goes out and he writes this thing and he gives it to Andy. And after a period of time, Andy gives it back to him and says, why don't you go out and do some goddamn research? I could write that in a bathtub in Iowa. So Andy's view was more information was better. You collected as much information you could. Don't think that what you got was the Rosetta Stone when somebody told you something. Just take it as a data point and continue to collect and sort. And then eventually, something's going to emerge out of that. He had one of his researchers came to him one day and said, I'm reading this Chinese literature and they're talking about the strategic importance of this province in China. And, I looked at the map and I looked at towns around there. I can't figure out why that's so important. And so Andy at the time had been developing this hypothesis that China was developing an anti-access area denial capability. And so Andy just took that data point and thanked him, thought about it. But then he sent a request off the intelligence community and said, do you have any indication that China's developing an anti-access area denial capability? And of course, the answer that came back was no, we have no indication of that whatsoever. So Andy tasked the NRO to go take some photos of this strategic province. And the pictures came back and they were building an over-the-horizon radar. Well, an over-the-horizon radar is really useful if you're building an anti-access area denial capability because you want to know when and where the enemy is coming. And but he was able to take different pieces, all source, but the cue was coming from this unclassified Chinese literature that one of his researchers told him about. He didn't just seize on that and say, oh, look, there's a strategically important province, don't know why. But he collected more data using other sources, in this case, classified ones, to try to complete the picture of what was going on. Well, once he had that, of course, they could do a lot of other things developing that. So collect a lot of sources, be sort of skeptical, don't seize on the first thing that you find as being the answer, and try to find other pieces of information to either support or rebut it as you develop this. And it's going to take time and a lot of effort.
And I would just add 2 quick points. One is patience, right? So Andy, on at least one occasion, had sat through kind of a 3-day conference that was, a series of not entirely fascinating briefings and lectures. And at the end of it, he was asked, did you get anything out of that? Why did you sit through all that? And he said, well, on the second day in the afternoon, this one presenter had this one little nugget that was useful. So he was willing, to sort through a lot of chaff to find the one, grain of wheat. The second thing is that he was also kind of willing to give people who are, within reason, interesting, a couple of chances, right? He'd say, okay, we'll maybe fund a small project once, see how you do. And, even if it doesn't work out, he might be willing to fund a second, but he probably is not going to fund a third, and it would be smaller ones at first, and you kind of build up to something larger. So, he was measured in his approach. As Jeff said, he's not going to just kind of immediately embrace everybody with an alternative viewpoint, but he was willing to listen and be patient and kind of see how things played out.
So I can attest to his first story because I was in that conference too. I wasn't working for Andy at the time, but of course I coordinated with him about going there. And it was so mind-numbing, I left after the first day. I told him, I said, I can't do this anymore. It's just not worth my time and effort. He said, okay. And I said, well, are you going to stay? And he goes, yeah, I think I will. And he went back the next day. And it was actually a 2-day conference. And the nugget he found was the last presenter on the last day. And he had that guy come in and talk to him about doing some work, developing this idea that he had. So I told Andy, I said, that's why you're Andy Marshall, I'm not. I just do not have the patience to just sit there and listen to this garbage, just looking for that little that little golden nugget, and you just have to be patient.
Yeah, Jeff, that's a great segue into the next question, which is how much of this technique and this approach to strategy and to strategic understanding can be done without Andy Marshall? So a lot of it is his magic and his special sauce and his unique abilities and unique talents as an individual. Where are we able to continue to do this kind of stuff as a nation today that can learn from his legacy and his techniques and his methodologies and his approaches and his overall inspiration? And where do you think we're just going to be fundamentally limited? We're never going to be able to do that because only he was able to do that. Can you guys talk a little bit about, and Jamie, also, if you want to jump in on this as well,
Yeah, I'd like to start.
Is it can go beyond just man.
Yeah, I'd like to start if possible. And Jeff and Bob, I'm sorry to bug in. So one of the things that people don't know about Andy, and that's one of the reasons that the foundation is looking for new voices, is Andy was a voice. And I tell this story all the time. Oh, I try to tell all the time. A short time before Andy passed away, and he and I were chatting, and he said that the thing that bothered him the most was that he had lost his voice. Now, I was surprised. I suspect Jeff and Bob would be surprised because, I mean, Andy didn't talk much. And I said to him, I said, you know, I don't understand. And he looked at me for a few minutes and it seemed like forever. And he finally said, I'm not talking about my voice. And what he was talking about was his ability to think and to bring other people together. His voice was not just Andy. His voice was a lot of people. This person that they just talked about at the end of the conference who brought up this nugget. You know, that's how Andy thought. I mean, he was very interdisciplinary with his thinking. When he started at Rand in the early 50s, you know, Andy's voice was a conglomeration of a lot of very smart people, Herman Kahn and just a whole bunch of, and that's the way it's always been. And Andy is, you know, his brain worked as such that he could synthesize so many different ideas. But he always looked for people that could do the same thing. Jeff, Bob?
No, that's right. But I think, Will, on your question, it can be done today. Doesn't require an Andy Marshall. He was fine with saying there's no question it's so difficult that you can't improve understanding it by doing some thinking and some serious research. And what he was trying to do was get people to do serious research. You know, get them the question and let them go out and just root around and see what they come up with. I remember one time I was in the office when I was working for him, and Ed Litvak came in, and he had done a study for Andy, and he had sent it in to Andy. He was waiting to talk to Andy and see what Andy's reaction was. And I was out in the outer office when he came in, and we were chatting, and he turned to me, he said, why is it when Andy Marshall gives you something to do, you're sitting here just nervous as hell, like a grad student waiting for a grade on their paper, wondering what his response is going to be to what you turned in? And I said, because it's Andy Marshall. He said, I know, it drives me crazy. But everybody sort of had that kind of reaction, you know, doing that work. You try to do your best work for him. And I think that's what Jamie's trying to do with the foundation and trying to continue Andy's legacy. Everybody just should try to do the best that they can do. It's not going to be perfect. And if you keep working at it over time, it'll get better and it'll get better and it'll get better. But it's not impossible. And if you follow some of the things that we've been talking about, focus on the long-term competition, try to do diagnostics, not be prescriptive. You follow some of those things and just work hard at it, you'll be able to make an impact.
Yeah, I would just add that for me, the biggest challenge to kind of implementing that approach is the desire for immediate solutions. Right? I mean, I've conducted workshops here where I have specifically said, this is a diagnostic workshop. We are trying to understand what the key problems are. We are not here to develop solutions. And it is almost impossible to get people to kind of stay at that level of, let's understand the problem first. Let's ask the hard questions. before we immediately leap to trying to solve something. And again, that, as Jeff said, it's a matter of strategic patience, and really doubling down on asking the good question and diagnosing the problem first before you jump to solving it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. As just broadening that out a second, beyond focusing on his emphasis on the descriptive piece of this challenge, what are some of the other major pitfalls that all three of you would highlight for students that are interested in practicing net assessment and engaging in this kind of analysis? What are the key, dare I say, methodological challenges to doing net assessment? What are the common mistakes, the common ways this kind of stuff goes off the rails? The things that distinguish really good net assessments from really crappy net assessments. In your experiences, what are things that you'd want to suggest for people to keep an eye out for in terms of pitfalls from a methodology perspective? And while you guys think of that for a second, if you do have any more questions, you want to raise them in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, you could type those up and Colleen will be able to triage those to the appropriate folks here. Go ahead.
So while I was working in the office, I did see some crappy net assessments, and Andy thought they were crappy too. And generally where they went wrong was they got off the rails in terms of what question they were trying to answer. You know, Andy would give them an area, let's say a space net assessment, and it was up to the person working for him to develop what's the framework here and get Andy to approve it. But it was like a dissertation. You got to figure out what's the right thing here. And so they would develop one that looks like it's kind of right, and he lets them start working on it. And then they go off the rails because they start pursuing something that they think is really the answer to the question, and it's not. So in one case, I know that they ended up, the space net assessment ended up focusing just on the space-based assets that would support precision strike, long-range precision strike. Well, certainly the space competition was far broader than that. And so that ended up being kind of a crappy net assessment. Another one Andy characterized as being sort of a Inspector General's report. It was a litany of the deficiencies and shortfalls of U.S. forces in Korea and why they would not be able to successfully withstand, an attack by the DPRK. Well, that's not a net assessment. That is barely an IG report because it didn't bring in the competitor, and it didn't do the things that you need to do to say, on balance, who's got an advantage in this area, and what does that advantage look like, and is it a long-term advantage or not? So if you just focus on yourself and you just focus on weaknesses, and if you start pursuing things that is just a small subset of the larger set, you're not going to succeed in developing a good net assessment.
And the one thing I would add is the need for both relevant and good data. So Jeff has told the story about when he started and when the office started kind of looking at the Warsaw NATO Pact balance. One of the problems is we really didn't have very good data. And we find it even today, all of the time, that in particular, getting data on ourselves, getting accurate data about kind of US and Western capabilities is frankly often more difficult than getting data about potential competitors, because there is no, and for good reasons, there is no intelligence community that focuses on gathering information about US military forces, right? And then the other part of it is, as I said, is getting the most relevant data, right? So sometimes the kinds of things that are available don't really answer the kinds of questions that are in fact the most important.
So
I'm going to jump in real quick, Jeff.
Go ahead.
Jeffrey. Okay. So, I mean, Jeff and Bob have actually outlined some of the reasons and the things to do. I mean, Jeffrey's notion of getting out of the office. You can't do it in the office, although you can count on the people that are in that office to keep you on the straight and narrow most of the time. Sometimes they play jokes on you and let you go off in a different area. Stick to the question. Stick to the problem that Andy and you have agreed upon is the problem that you're trying to diagnose. It's not solving. Okay, don't do it in a vacuum. It's got to be interdisciplinary research, and it requires reaching out to a lot of smart people. So it's back to this getting out of the office. Literature searches are great for PhD dissertations, I think, but they don't do much for you other than heading you in the right direction if you're going to do a net assessment. And finally, two last things. One is that you really have to take a systems analysis approach to the problem. And it's not the traditional systems analysis that I have a problem with in the Department of Defense, which is they take two choices or maybe three choices if they're really bold and pick one. You've got to see where the analysis takes you, and you've got to take the time to go down these roads and flesh them out. And so the last thing I say is that you're not time bound. If a net assessment to be done right, it's not one of these things you have to turn in by the end of the day. I mean, Jeffrey, and I tell everybody this, Andy thought that Jeffrey's assessment was the best net assessment ever done in his office. And Jeffrey took a long time to get it done. But Andy was also okay if you didn't finish it. But if you were doing the work and you ran out of time because the military system said you got to leave in 4 years or 3 years, he would find somebody else to come in and work on it. All yours, Jeff.
So in all fairness, I was, the saying is standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm not sure my predecessors were giants, but there had been a heck of a lot of work done in the previous 10 years on the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance. Part of it was just building a database because there wasn't one when they started doing that in 1972. And so they hired a contractor, BDM Corporation, it's not around anymore, to build and maintain a database over the years and to put things in analogous categories and to use similar accounting rules. So you're comparing apples with apples, not apples and oranges. And that so seldom is done. And hardly anybody does that outside of the Office of Net Assessment. It takes money, it takes time. Again, I had 10 years worth of work done by various organizations that I was able to pull together and do my net assessment. So I was able to do that in less than 3 years. It's pretty awesome. So
I wasn't picking on PhD candidates, I'm sorry.
Well, we answer this question that John threw up there in chat?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
So he took the time to write it. We ought to take time to answer it, I guess. So I don't think he worried about competition becoming an end in itself. I think he worried about the competition coming to an end in the form of a conflict. If the competition kept going, that was fine with him as long as we were continuing to improve our areas of advantage, whether it's undersea warfare or whatever the areas might be, and build new areas of advantage in space, et cetera. So I don't think he was worried about the competition becoming an end in itself. I think he was worried about the competition coming to an end in the form of a conflict.
Yeah, and he was, particularly by the early 80s, he was increasingly convinced that the Soviet Union was in trouble, right? And so, I mean, there was maybe some concern, as Jeff suggested, that it might end poorly. But I think he was anticipating that it would, in fact, end, and was increasingly confident that it would end in favor of the West and the United States.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, and speaking of ends, we are growing close to ours for today. But I wanted to let everybody know that on September 12th, so after summer, because we are an academic institution, so summer is the giant pause button on all things in the luxury of academia. So on September 12th, we're going to come back together. I'd encourage folks that are interested in these topics And we're explicitly going to think about applying net assessment type tools to some of the contemporary challenges that we're thinking about in today's day and age. So today we want to do this first, which is more retrospective and thinking about what those tools look like and how that toolkit can be brought to bear in a systematic way, and to think about and appreciate the contributions of Andy Marshall to strategic thinking in the US. There was one final question that came across here about outlying thinkers. That this was one of the key ingredients that Andy Marshall told this individual was necessary for a good net assessment. How are we encouraging that outlying thinking today? That outlying thinkers, where do they get to flourish and sort of grow and expand some of their potentially innovative or off the wall concepts? One of the things I've always admired about ONA within the larger DoD conglomerate is how unique it is in its own self-defined role as a burr in the saddle, that it's designed to be marching to its own drumbeat, to ask the other questions, to take that long-term perspective, to be relatively institutionally inconvenient. And I've always admired the DoD for keeping it around because it recognizes the value of something like that organizationally. So can some of you talk a little bit about where this outlying thinking finds refuge today in terms of little dark corners of places, or how we could do that within our own organizations and institutions?
So I want to put a plug in for the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. And that's our new voices, is these people that, I mean, they're not just outliers, but they're people that want to, that are fearless, that are explorers, that are not afraid to be outliers. And we want to give them the opportunity to do that. I mean, we're growing, we're 2 years old basically. And, anybody that wants to join in and they have ideas on things they want to write about, they want to respond to the experiments that we put out, we're looking forward to it. I mean, it's the ultimate goal is to create these generations of strategic thinkers. McKitrick and Angevine and I are going to go off and play golf one of these days. And,
golf.
So Angevine and McKitrick and I are probably going to go off and play golf one of these days, and I'll be driving the golf cart, but it'll be far away. So thank you, though.
Excellent.
So, well, Andy was not trying to be a burr under the saddle. In fact, he wouldn't even talk to the other people in the department for years. I mean, he felt his role was to speak truth to power to the secretary. And so he wasn't trying to be a burr under the saddle. He was like, when Harry Truman was campaigning and somebody yelled, "Give him hell, Harry." He said, "I don't give him hell. I just tell them the truth. They think it's hell." Well, that's the way that Andy was. He just told them the truth. And then people thought it was a burr under the saddle because they were doing the wrong things. But he wasn't trying to be a burr under the saddle. He was just trying to serve the secretary.
Yeah. And I would just add in kind of in conclusion, another plug for multidisciplinarity, right? That before we came on air, we were talking about Skunk Baxter, a former member of the Doobie Brothers, who became a kind of leading expert on missile defense and space capabilities. And sometimes it's, taking people with expertise in a different field and exposing them to some of the questions in the national security realm and maybe getting a completely different perspective can be really helpful.
Excellent. Yeah, and another good testament to the importance of the luxury that our society affords these big brains to kick them up in the ivory tower and let them think big thoughts is to allow for that pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of truth, and then the duty that's incumbent upon us to speak that truth where we find it to the system. And that's one of the things that I think does yield better policy overall in the long run. That's one of the major advantages that our society has, having embraced these values of freedom of thought and the ability to have free expression and to pursue knowledge wherever it leads you. That's the actual reason why there is such a thing as tenure, even though it often gets pilloried. And the whole idea is that it frees people up to really pursue truth, no matter where that truth takes them, without fear of consequences. So,
hey, well, one last thing.
Wrap us up. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that people understand we're not looking for the next Andy Marshall. I mean, we'd love to find one. We'd love to find him, but that might be on a golf course.
Or her.
But the point is that we want people like Oz, and I see Jonathan Paris on here and other folks, you know, these are the kind of people that are out there. I think that what you're doing at the Bush School is an opportunity for finding these outliers, if you want to call them that way, these new voices, these thinkers. And the more people, the more places we can get people doing this, I believe the country will be much better off in the future.
Excellent. Great. Well, we're 3 minutes beyond our scheduled time. So join me in thanking our speakers today and appreciate it. And stay tuned on September 12th. We'll pick up the conversation and have a current application to it, if you will.
Thank you.
And thank you again for our
Great
partners
session.
in all this, the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation, the Intelligence Studies Program at the Bush School, the Center for Grand Strategy, and yours truly, the Economic Statecraft Program. So thank you all. This is a great event.
Thank you.
Take care.
Hey, Jamie, thank you. It's a great session.